Best story I ever heard is from Neil Hughes, who pastored in Montgomery, Alabama for 15 or 20 years and then went to work for North American Mission Board. Neil started 52 apartments in 5 years by prayer walking, just him and God. He said he'd go 7 weeks in a row to an apartment complex. He'd go the same time every week, Saturday at 5 p.m. or Tuesday at 7 p.m. But he'd go 7 times. And every time, he wouldn't make a scene. He'd just walk along and he would try to pray for every apartment. If he saw something that gave a hint about what kind of person lived there, if he saw a tricycle, he prayed for the toddler that lived there. If he saw a wheelchair ramp, he prayed for the older person that lived there. And he just prayed what he could. God, make yourself real and known to this person who lives in this apartment. Show them that you love them and care about them and want to have your hand involved in their life. And, he'd stay about an hour, hour and a half, and every week go back and pray again. He said usually by the 4th or 5th week, someone would stop him in the apartments. And they'd say, "Hey, I saw you out here last week. What are you doing here?" And he'd say, "Honestly, I'm just praying for people in these apartments. I'm praying that God would show His love and be good to them and be working for good in their lives." And he'd say, "Is there something that I could pray about for you or your family or somebody that you love?" And interestingly enough, almost always they'd say yes. They'd say, "Sure, my husband's in the hospital with diabetes," or my 7th grade daughter's flunking algebra, or my teenage son is experimenting with drugs. And so Neil would just pray with them there, sometimes silently, sometimes aloud, never making a scene, always making it about prayer. And then he'd check back with them the next week. And what do you think God would do? Well, sometimes God would just answer the prayer. Sometimes God would give grace sufficient. Sometimes God would answer a little piece of the prayer. But God would begin to show Himself at work in their life. And when God begins to work in somebody's life, you don't need a hot dog to attract them. They're interested in God. They see God's beginning to work. And so Neil would say, "Well, let me come back again next week. Maybe I could come to your apartment and we could just I stay about 10 minutes and we'll just pray again." He said so often they'd say, "Sure, come on by, Tuesday at 7 o'clock. He'd go by. And a week or two he'd say, "Maybe you have a friend or two that would like to join us, or a family member." And first thing you know, there are 4 or 5 or 6 people, and he's going by and praying with them. One week he says, "Well, before we pray, let me read Psalms 23. It has a lot of comfort in it." And so he'd read it, and they'd talk about it for a few minutes. And then there'd be an old lady down at the corner whose husband died, and she was living on a limited income, and he'd tell the group, "Why don't we make a casserole and take her?" And suddenly he's got them doing ministry. And as they become more comfortable, he'd ask different ones, "Share your journey to finding God." And they'd invite their friends, and they'd be sharing about their Christ journey. And before you know it, they're worshiping and discipling and having community and ministering and sharing their faith. Sounds a lot like church. 52 in 5 years. It'll work.